echoey for people? No, not echoey. Good. Thank you for getting up early. Thank you for coming to Cholula. Thank you for being here in this space with us. In an increasingly unstable world, how does the STS Toolkit help us deal with ongoing loss and disappearance? Today's talks will attempt to excavate the meanings of loss by observing the fragments that remain. By examining what lays below the watermark in rivers and in aquifers, and below loosely packed dirt in shallow graves, the speakers will highlight how science and technology serve to both centre and to destabilise our shared sense of reality. In developing this plenary session over the last few months, which was such a pleasure, themes of loss were prominent in our discussions. This year of opening up, while the risks of COVID still loom large, has been one of profound loss that have pushed many of us to our emotional limits. Much of the world has been at a tipping point for a long time, on the edge of environmental catastrophe, on the edge of reality, on the edge of reason. COVID, in many ways, has pushed us over that edge. Over the last 3 years, while the physical movement of billions was severely curtailed by lockdowns, a big portion of humanity dived down various rabbit holes of misinformation. Millions are forging into the metaverse armed with cryptocurrency. And meanwhile, in real life, any early pandemic solidarity that we saw in many countries has dissolved into trickle-down indifference, despite the hopes of some philosophers that communal disruption would lead to a revolution. Rising sea levels, frequent floods, and record heat waves are shrinking the zone of human habitability. The world seems a darker place than before the pandemic. Even as coming here together in Cholula has lifted our spirits and feels like something approaching normal, maybe, we are reminded of the thousands of lives lost to the pandemic and to all everyday kinds of violence. What can these magnified moments of loss, both of human and non-human life, serve to help us understand our larger societal obligations as scholars living in extreme times? What can receding waters tell us about our past and our present society? So I'm going to introduce our 3 plenary speakers, and they'll speak for around 15 minutes. And at the end, we'll have some time for comments from our in-person audience. And I believe we do have a Teams audience. And so people on Teams can use the Q&A function to put in any comments or questions. And at the conclusion of that part of the session today, we'll have a presentation from Sandra Gonzalez Santos from Universidad Anáhuac, Mexico, on the In Memoriam project that was curated and brought together especially for this conference, and that will be available for viewing after the plenary over there. And just to foreshadow, so the last part of the presentation will be some music for you to stand up and stretch and view the installation. Okay, so I'm going to just introduce all the speakers, the 3 speakers now, and then we can just speak without ruining the flow. Gabriela Soto Laveaga is Professor of the History of Science and Antonio Madera Professor for the Study of Mexico at Harvard University. Her first book, Jungle Laboratories, Mexican Peasants, National Projects and the Making of the Pill, won the Robert K. Merton Best Book Prize in Science, Knowledge and Technology Studies. The book showed how Mexican farmers and scientists were at the center of the global quest for synthetic steroid hormones, and in doing so challenged narratives of well-known chemical discoveries. She's completing two book projects at the moment, one on doctors as agents of social unrest, and her third book, which examines agricultural science exchange between India and Mexico to explain the circulation of knowledge using crops. Our second speaker will be Vivek Garcia Deister, who is a professor in the Faculty of Sciences of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. Her research focuses on the history of race science and the epistemologies of biomedical and forensic genetics. She assesses the impact of biomedical and forensic genetics on issues of racism, health, and justice in Mexico. Her work has been published in international academic journals based both in the global north and in Latin America, and in non-academic spaces such as Slate, Future Tense, Este País, and Letras Libres. Vivet is the incoming editor-in-chief of the journal Tapuya, Latin American Science, Technology and Society. And then we have Andrea Ballestero, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Southern California. She's also Director of the Ethnography Studio. Her first book, A Future History of Water, examines how government officials and NGOs in Costa Rica and Northeast Brazil differentiate between water as a human right and water as a commodity. She proposes the notion of a techno-legal device as a site for future making. She's also the co-editor of Experimenting with Ethnography, a companion to analysis, a collection of experimental protocols that expand the meaning of ethnographic analyses. Dr. Ballestero is currently writing a book that explores cultural imaginaries of the underground in Costa Rica, focusing on how the emergence of aquifers into the public sphere via hydrogeology and discussions over private property is expanding the social world downwards into subterranean space. So I will invite Gabriela, and maybe we can thank all of our speakers in. Oh, okay.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buenos días. Thank you so much. I think that's the first time an emergency message has been played before my talk. And I think the first emergency might be if I fall off of the stadium, because this is really, really close. So people in the emergency, stay close by. So first of all, thank you so much for that wonderful and generous introduction and for the invitation to be here with you today. In early August 2022, as historic heat waves broke records, riverbeds dried in Europe, the United States, Latin America, and beyond. As bodies of water ran dry, forgotten worlds emerged, alongside past which were meant to remain below the water's surface. as we experience historic climate change fueled drought, bodies of water are regurgitating the past. What does it mean for us, contemporary scholars, when our pasts, presents, and futures collide above the watermark? How are these discoveries altering how we understand our present and potentially our attempts to alter a climate changed future? Entire cities, some that had never been cataloged before, have resurfaced, coughed up during extreme weather. For example, do I need to? Oh, I can do this myself. Okay, great. Technology. For example, the draining of the Mosul Dam reservoir in Iraq to attempt to save crops that would be lost to drought revealed an unknown ancient city. As the press reported, quote, with just days to examine the area before the waters came back, archaeologists successfully mapped what they believed to have been a major city in the Mitanni Empire, built 3,400 years ago. Equally, in Spain, the village of Aceredo in the country's north, last seen in 1992 when it was flooded to make way for a 630 megawatt hydropower plant, was not only visible, but tourists could walk the formerly submerged streets and photograph eerie images of a village life interrupted to make way for hydraulic power. But it's not just forgotten bridges, roads, and cities that are resurfacing. Previously unknown dinosaur footprints reveal deeper histories of non-human life. But also, coming to the surface, are lives cut short that were meant to remain hidden. For example, in the American West, murdered bodies have emerged. The first body was found at the Lake Mead Recreation Area near Las Vegas. A drought has depleted the lake, a crucial water source for 25 million people, drying out tributaries, threatening hydropower production, and closing boat ramps at the popular recreation site. It is now at its lowest level since the lake was filled in 1937. It is also the largest reservoir that feeds the Hoover Dam. By a month ago, a total of 6 skeletal remains had been found in this body of water. The bodies appeared to be coming in such quick succession that a law firm, known for its offbeat humor billboards, advertised the following services. Apparently, many viewers did not understand that the billboard was a self-parody of lawyers and lawsuits. Despite these grisly findings, in some ways more alarming for some was the resurfacing of Hungerstein, or the Hunger Stones, such as the one from the Elbe River, which ominously read, "If you see me, weep." The stone, dating to the devastating drought of 1616, had already resurfaced in the 21st century during the drought of 2018. Yet in 2022, Europe's drought was reported to be on course to be the worst one in 500 years. Hence the emergence of the 406-year-old warning of famine, plagues, and social unrest sent journalists and doomsayers loose on the internet and social media, where articles, blogs, and musings coincided that the stones were forgotten oracles of doom. Hunger stones had emerged from rivers before, even in years without drought, and their resurfacing was still linked to human intervention. For example, with the construction of dams or canals that altered river flows. Yet, as a writer remarked, quote, "This year, a record number of stones have resurfaced, and new stones uncovered that had not been recorded in living memory." Curiously, the initial stories of the Hunger Stones were linked to a story that emerged in a tweet from 2018. In other words, the frenzied messages with Hunger Stones in the summer of 2022 had a more recent past. And there's this blog post that said, "We must put the Hunger Stones stories within historical context, tracing it back to the street." While the world was seemingly transfixed on the Hunger Stones in the past few months, we seemed to be missing the larger picture. In some ways, the revealing of the stones, as opposed to the receding water level, as opposed to the receding water level alone, was seen to be a calamitous event. In fact, with the Hunger Stone stories, we seem to have once again made the visible the trait that mattered. When it comes to water futures, however, it is what lies unseen below, the groundwater, diminishing water tables, and polluted aquifers that will help determine how humanity will live into the future. To state the obvious, the stone's warnings send a different meaning to us today than that to those who inscribed them, and even to those who saw them 100 years ago in 1921. Our cultural understanding and scientific knowledge of climate change shapes how our contemporary society reads this warning. Moreover, the stone's emergence, while we are still in a pandemic moment, seem to have acquired more gravitas, as we all seem to be more attuned to our own and our community's mortality. While the stones have emerged at different times in our past, it is technology that allows us to, quote, witness what was once site-specific. Through images and news coverage, all different traces left by receding waters are seen at once, just as I showed you minutes ago. The dinosaur tracks, the bodies, the archaeological sites, and the hunger stones. These are all site and temporal events that together become evidence of a planetary phenomena. This jumble of time, all lying in wait below the waterline, can be seen as remarkable bullet points of life and extinction on Earth. Civilizations that have fallen into disrepair, whose foundational blocks now lie submerged and forgotten at the foot of megacities. In some ways, the receding waters give us a preview of what future archaeologists might see when we are no longer here. In a recent environmental essay, historian Bathsheba DeMuth reminds us that, quote, change in a pattern in the land is no danger if you do not see it in time, end quote. Yet what if the frame we are using to evaluate current ecological disasters consists of timescales that limit our understanding and thus our potential social and technological solutions? In this brief talk, I wish to examine our ability to recuperate, using these found material objects that have resurfaced as the entry point to question how to best carry our pasts into the future, especially in this ongoing pandemic present, when we don't yet fully know what we have lost. Instead of focusing on these objects, I wish to use the examples of what remains invisible that is important to a potential future. I will think through what this year's theme invites us to ponder, using knowledges in technoscience for living together, especially when it seems, through a fixation with, say, hunger stones, that we have already failed in that endeavor. Many of the images and articles that went viral, as I said, in 2022, turned out to be from 2018. What does that tell us about what knowledge circulates and how often it comes to the surface? If we place water, hunger, and receding water lines together, an apt site to think with is the United States-Mexico border, in particular, the Water Treaty of 1944. In 1944, when this treaty was written up, each country was seeking to demonstrate the contemporary use, in particular the Water Treaty of 1944, which, though written nearly 80 years ago, binds the United States and Mexico into measures of water that no longer exist. When an initial water treaty between Mexico and the United States was first hammered out in the 19th century, water was not understood as part of an ecological system. Rather, it was seen as something isolated, measurable, and plentiful. These beliefs colored the science and made it into a treaty that has now created impossible obligations, especially for Mexico. According to the 1944 Water Treaty that is still in effect today, Mexico owes water to the United States. But the history of this treaty, examined by scholars on both sides of the border, revealed the difficulty in accurately measuring the futures of water, as Andrea Ballestero tells us. In 1944, when this treaty was written up, each country was seeking to demonstrate the contemporary use of water so that the number could be projected into the future. The scramble to prove evidence of use was entangled with agricultural futures. But rivers have lives of their own. And as data from researchers on both sides of the border illustrate, when it came to water, this research didn't often align. Moreover, in the decade before the 1944 treaty, there was a series of unusually rainy seasons that became the measure from which to gather the data, leading to faulty readings and faulty assumptions. Finally, 80 plus years ago, researchers could not have imagined our climate change world changing so rapidly. So this treaty from 1944 is based on faulty science because we didn't have the technology to understand the groundwater, nor did we have an understanding of how water would be diminishing so quickly in the years since then. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you so much. So what has happened is that Mexico and the US share underground water basins, as you see here. And what this makes it incredibly difficult to quantify. With our climate changed world, what we have now is what the New York Times called a water war. The water wars at the border, in which each country is trying to, using the 1944 water treaty as the guide to try to understand how much water each country deserves in this space. And in that calculation, Mexico owes the United States water. And what this article and others have shown is that the obligation of Mexico makes it that it first needs to repay that water before it can let water come to the Mexican farmers. In this instance, it is not hunger stones, but a 1944 science based on faulty understandings of hydrology and the future of rivers that serve as warnings to our future selves. How does the science of the present then translate into the future? More important, how do we write about water and border issues when much of this border is based on a river that is rapidly diminishing and disappearing? I was thinking about this when on my first day in Puebla, I was taken to the Amparo Museum. It was there that a pre-Hispanic figurine prompted me to rethink timescales and the value of meaning. Let me explain in my remaining minutes. So I was at the Amparo Museum and I come across this figure of Xipetotec, who is known as the Lord, our Lord, the Flayed One. And just very briefly, human sacrifice offerings were given to this god, and what this consisted of was that they would flay or take off the skin of those who were sacrificed, and priests would wear the skin for 20 days. And if you can observe there, I don't know if this has a pointer, you can see the skin with the 2 feet and the 2 hands, and he's wearing the skin of someone who has been offered for sacrifice. And what was fascinating to me is that this was a god of agriculture, and the idea that in order for you to create a new cycle of life, one life had to end, and you had to throw off the skin as one throws off the husks of seeds in order to provide new life. So they would cover both stones and the priest with this, and it was a symbol of regeneration, of renewal, of providing new seeds, something that is the theme in many ways of this conference. So while this might seem grotesque to our eyes, it was the god of agriculture, fertility, and war, the god of life, but who needed to see the end of one cycle in order for another to begin. In short, to have life, we needed death. As I stood there transfixed in front of the glass case, I fell into the seductive analytic trap of attempting to find 21st century meaning in a 14th century deity. Was there a lesson about how we carry our histories, our pasts? How we need to carry our past selves into the future, shedding those shells before we move into the new season? As these thoughts began to spin, I read the last sentence of the description. So the last sentence allowed me to return to the theme of this conference, how we recuperate. Followers of Xipetotec, I learned in the Museum of Puebla, understood this well. For in the depiction found in the museum, which is here, which is about transformation and renovation, I just want to point out to something on his face, on his nose. A butterfly, the symbol of transformation, of hope, of renovation, that life continues after an end. In conclusion, in precarious times, what is the obligation of scholars? Do we speak about impermanence of human history, or do we instead choose to muse about what survives? Is it useful to think about loss instead? How can we explain emerging pasts that are colliding? The stones show us that it is not the first, nor will it be the last time that we find ourselves in precarious times. The stone was carved as a warning, but was intended for future generations, for us. Despite the hunger and chaos, there was reason to believe that there would be an us to read the stone. It served as a warning, yes, but it also was also carved as an instance of care. As we recuperate in this season of loss of life, of loss of rights, loss of nature, and loss of humanity, maybe we can turn to the Hungerstein and see them not only as harbingers of catastrophe, but also as revealing other meanings, especially when we move beyond a Western-centric understanding of a world that ends and another one that begins. Thank you so much.
Buen dia, buen dia, good morning. It is a pleasure and an honor to share the podium with my fellow colleagues, very distinguished scholars. Without. Anterior. The time seems right to draw your attention to a football stadium. Yes, I said football, not soccer. The Estadio Azteca, which we see here under construction in 1963. It is currently the third largest stadium on the American continent, the largest in Mexico, and one of the largest in Latin America. It is a prime example of mid-20th century functionalist architecture that combines utility with firmness, an aesthetic symbol of power. This is the same stadium where legendary footballer Diego Maradona scored the notorious Hand of God, La Mano de Dios, a handball goal that won the Argentine team a historic and geopolitically charged victory over England during the 1986 FIFA World Cup semifinals, a goal that led Argentina to their overall victory. On that day, the Azteca was at its full capacity. 110,000 people filled the stadium to the brim. Look at the image of the Gargantuan Stadium. Imagine the roaring sound of the multitude celebrating Maradona's goal, which could be heard over a mile away from the stadium. Feel the crowd-induced vibration of the concrete bleachers and columns. Or better yet, don't imagine it, listen to it. Escuchen. Now consider this. We would need one full Estadio Azteca to represent the number of persons currently listed in Mexico's National Registry of the Missing and Disappeared. The word stadium comes from the Latin stadium, which means a measure of length. There's also an etymological connection to stand, which is to occupy a place, be valid, exist, take place, be fixed, stop, maintain one's position, remain. As of this morning, the official figure of missing and disappeared is 108,730 persons. But this is not a fixed measure of the extent of disappearance. The figure is adjusted every single day, and far from coming to a stop, new cases are filed and take place in this imaginary stadium. These numbers, which some consider to be a gross underestimation of the actual figure, would be shocking in a war-torn dictatorship, but they are produced within a democracy. Nominally democratic Mexico has claimed one of the largest counts of missing persons in the history of Latin America. The beginning of Mexico's dirty war coincided in the 1960s. It overlapped with the construction of the Estadio Azteca. Pedro Ramírez Vázquez, the visionary architect who designed the stadium, claimed to have built a democratic monument, one in which all spectators watch with excellent isoptics. This means that there isn't a single column or support structure to block the view to the field, wherever one might be seated. But understanding the extent of disappearance, a reckoning of what remains from these persons' absence, can only begin to be visualized by shifting the view from the field to the bleachers. There is nothing emptier than an empty stadium, lamented a sports commentator as he described the desolate Azteca in March 2020, when COVID restrictions banned access to the stadium. What is emptier than over 100,000 missing persons? And how does one begin to study this loss from an STS perspective? Mexican intellectual Luis Villoro gave us a clue when he offered absence as philosophical dictum for democracy. Instead of starting from a consensus to establish justice, he wrote, start from its absence. Start from the perception of real injustice to project what could remedy it. As I grapple with absence as epistemological starting point, I, like Edith Rogoff, am finding the notion of without a very productive one because it intimates process rather than method. For her, without is a condition in which you might find yourself while doing work. Rogoff is tackling visual culture, not disappearance. But I find her awareness that the position of being without is not a form of negation of existing subjects or methods, nor lack of these, compelling. It's a move that counters the stasis and immobility of simply not knowing. And it differs from other ways of knowing that involve absence, such as agnotology and absentology. Agnotology, as defined by Robert Proctor and Londa Shibinger, refers to the structural production of ignorance. These philosophers charted a path to explore how or why we don't know. In their programmatic volume on the topic, secrecy, uncertainty, confusion, silence, absence, and impotence are terms that the authors associate with ignorance. While I am not denying that these may be attributes of the problem of mass disappearance in Mexico, my position with respect to absence is not one of deficit, but rather one of surplus. Again, close to 100,000 absences create a void that is ontologically and epistemologically distinct from the one left by the absence of knowledge. Recall the roar of the stadium, only to fathom the silence. These people are not simply not there. They were either forcibly taken or their absence exceeds the legal category of enforced disappearance. The way in which knowing without is generative is also distinct from ignorance's unique prompt for knowledge, which is the constant effort to destroy or at least reduce ignorance. In knowing without, absence of knowledge is not the object of interest. Knowing without also differs from Jennifer Croissant's sociology of things that are not there. In Croissant's view, both ignorance and absence converge in the privative, that is, a specific form of absence in relation to a known presence, which in her view allows for studies of absence to eliminate studies of ignorance. In this way, agnotology and absentology become complementary epistemologies. Yet knowing without is not absentology, because although these people have disappeared, their absence is not empty and leaves something behind that can be felt, experienced, and known. In contrast to Cressant's theory, my approximation to absence has been bottom-up. It is based on a decade of field noting the growth of disappearance and death in Mexico. We have one Estadio Azteca full of disappeared persons, but we could also fill half a stadium with the 52,000 unidentified remains currently kept in Mexico's forensic services. The challenge is how to empirically approach what is not there. The ethnography of without is always partial, fragmentary. There's also the issue of what remains with us after we've spent some time in the forensic landscape, or in my case, the labscape. A place where a few Eppendorf tubes that contain tiny DNA samples seem to be at the same time crucial because they might one day make identification possible, and negligible because of the long odds of finding a match. DNA concentration is measured in nanograms, while human remains are often measured in kilograms. Faced with these contrasting scales of absence, what might an epistemology of without look like? Quantification is one avenue for tackling a void of surplus. Mexico's National Registry makes a distinction between disappeared persons that satisfy the legal qualifications of enforced disappearance and missing persons. Of the current total, 95,385 are disappeared, desaparecidos, and 13,345 are missing or not located. To overcome the restrictive specificities of these concepts, Gabriel Gatti offers los desaparecidos as a category unconstrained by the legal limits of enforced disappearance. His concept is useful for analyzing myriad subjects, unlike enforced disappearance, which applies more narrowly to those vanished by the military dictatorships of the southern cone of Latin America during the 1970s. Disappeared and not located are the official terms used by Mexico's National Search Commission, but as a social category, los desaparecidos exceeds the first and captures both terms and figures. Los desaparecidos can be applied to different absences and contexts of without throughout Latin America. They can designate those who have been expelled, pariahs, the precarious, the vulnerable, abandoned lives. It is the ample geographic and demographic scope that lends this notion coverage, making it an agile concept that circulates globally, circulates very quickly, and lands locally in very diverse situations. Bruno Avendaño was 35 years old when he disappeared in 2011. Journalist Daniela Rea met Bruno's younger brother, Lucas, seen here, and found that for this young man from Veracruz, who has become an activist and performative artist, in the end, his entire family are disappeared, socially disappeared, non-existent for the state. She finds that missing Bruno is the incarnation of thousands of Mexicans throughout the country who, although they are not physically disappeared, are disappeared in other categories. Somos los desaparecidos, declares Lucas. Thus, Gabriel Gatti's diagnosis of disappearance as an overflowing category becomes painfully concrete in the pen of Daniela Rea and in the voice of Lucas, Bruno's brother. Other epistemic tools that allow us to confront what is not present come to mind. These deal with the spectral, the phantasmagoric. Writing about the disappeared in Argentina, Avery Gordon argues for the need to be attentive to the ghostly aspects of the social life of the disappeared. This means examining the relationship between knowledge and experience, what Gordon calls a sociology of haunting. Working in Mexico, anthropologists Rodrigo Parrini and Sabrina Melenot have noticed that the spectrality of disappearance, even its smell and silence, also transferred to the spaces, to the hostile, though not necessarily desolate terrains that announce absence. In their works, the landscape, be it the borderland, the river, or the morgue, operates as a heuristic device for knowing without. Thinking of the spectral allows us to know that silence can be a tangible way to engage absence. And not only the silence of an empty stadium. 2 months ago, the former head of Mexico's National Search Commission, seen here, faced trial for DNA trafficking. Journalists Paula Monaco and Wendy Perez chronicled the former commissioner's illegal distribution of a genetic database to a commercial laboratory. The company offered searching families the localization and genetic identification of their missing, while also negotiating contracts with local state forensic services. To one client, the families, they offered hope and the illusion of certainty. To the other client, the state itself, they offered access to the families as political legitimation in their future partnership. These findings prompted the court to investigate him, and the journalists noted another absence during the trial. The terms victims and disappeared were not mentioned during the trial by the parties questioned and during the questioning. The allegations revolved only around the trading of genetic profiles and the existence of a USB drive. This absence was particularly salient insofar as the existence of the database is predicated on finding and identifying the disappeared. The database cannot exist without them. This was not merely a discursive faux pas, but a blatant omission of the context in which misappropriation and misuse of the database was allowed. To express their bewilderment, the journalists turned to the one thing they have in common with the victims of disappearance, their own disappearance. They wrote, "Journalists who disappear from the living, killed because of the informative work. Journalists who investigate disappearance and death and point out the absence not only of the disappeared, but also of their mention in a judicial investigation into the illegal exchange of genetic data of the unnamed dead and the families who are looking for them. Genetic data that were supposedly produced in response to the crisis of death and disappearance, and that disappeared in turn from the official registry. The company claims they destroyed the database." The fact that the very people that investigate those who are not there are themselves disappearing reveals the social and political power of absence. It is precisely because of this power and the techno-science that it motivates that we must engage absence and venture to know without. We owe it to the silence of the empty stadium echoing in our ears. Thank you.
Muy buenos días, es realmente un gusto y un placer estar aquí. Primero quisiera agradecer a todas y todos los colegas de México que nos han recibido de esta manera y a las personas que nos están ayudando con la tecnología y con todo el trabajo que hay que hacer para que una reunión de este tipo sea posible. Así que les agradezco muchísimo a todas y a todos ustedes. Hoy, ahora voy a cambiar a inglés, voy a hacer la presentación del paper en inglés, pero en el periodo de respuestas, de preguntas y respuestas, ojalá podamos hablar en todos los idiomas que están presentes en la reunión. I come from a place where the planetary was never a concern. I think that I also come from a place where the Anthropocene never happened. As an epoch, the Anthropocene is as foreign as the planetary is as a scale of observation. I have never heard the people I work with talk about the Anthropocene or the planetary, or even of the ability to see the planet as a whole. And yet, the place that I come from is also one of those countries that have made some idea of the environment, with all of its contradictions, central to its sense of collectivity, to its national brand at a time when countries have brands, and to its legal architecture. That place is Costa Rica. In my current work, I attempt to decipher, as Sylvia Winter would have it, how people who see themselves as concerned with the environment make worlds amidst magnified moments of loss. How do they become geologic actors without drawing on categories that result from imperial and Cold War legacies, such as the planet or the Anthropocene? So to explore this question, I'm going to share my thoughts on three general concepts or ideas. The notion of casual planetarity, the idea of joining forces with water as a geological process, and scientific models. Let's begin with casual planetarity. Planetary awareness has become synonymous with large temporal, geographic, and geologic scales. Building on images of the oneness of the Earth from imperial and Cold War projects of global control, the idea of the planet is of course as much geological fact as it is geopolitical product. In the 21st century, planetarity is also an affective disposition that signals potential annihilation due to nuclear fallout, climate change, and more recently, of course, pandemic devastation. As a form of witnessing environmental harm, planetarity accounts for centuries of colonial extractive projects organized to dislodge matter to secure the accumulation of capitalist value. As crisis, planetary awareness captures the need for a different regime of relations with nature. In this context, to some people, concepts such as the Anthropocene provide analytic reprieve. They turn the planet into a modern structure of awareness. But in parallel to those concepts, we find a wealth of attempts to resculpt the Earth without drawing on notions of the planetary and without presuming the existence of an all-encompassing observer that these notions tend to presume. These alternative projects work with what is left. They draw on fragments to put together pictures. These efforts, though, are not retrospective diagnostics of what has happened, but are prospective forms of world making. We can think of these, if you allow it, as a form of casual planetarity that does not mobilize the Earth or the Anthropocene as a stable, spectacular category. Casual planetarities are loose. They open collective space for people's dreams and projects to operate imprecisely and in full awareness of the contradictory forces that pull people in different directions. And those people, of course, include all of us. These types of planetarities don't seek precise measurement. Furthermore, in this form of casual planetarity, the point is not to document the annihilation of life on Earth, but to become aware of the earthliness of everyday life. Following these casual engagements with the earthliness of the everyday leads us to scientific regimes that are not dominant or backed by the powers that be. It takes us to people who work with modest scientific threads, to people who turn seemingly insignificant happenings into conditions for what is to come. This casual orientation leads to the making of future histories, and in my case today, future histories of water as a geological force. Joining forces with water. SDS scholars have explored the question of geological presence by turning to the underground. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the underground helped imagine new technologies, helped imagine ways to seek refuge from disasters, and clarified evolutionary histories for those that were concerned with those. Today, scholars also rely on subterranean space to consider the material intimacies between human bodies and the subsurface, to envision the depth of time, and most recently, to consider how geological forces interrupt, undermine, or overwhelm the very conditions of being social. So to understand how geological forces condition sociality, I would say we should be very careful to not reproduce the visions that extractivist projects take for granted. That is, visions that promote industrial mining and oil and gas extraction as the natural destiny of the subsurface. But refusing the power of that extractivist mindset requires more than denouncing its woes. It requires pausing to ask, what do we take as the underground, as the geological? And for this purpose, I borrow a question that I find really helpful from Nigel Clark and Catherine Youssef, who ask, with what specific geological processes do different social actors join forces? In the past 30 years, to the extent that people explicitly join forces with geological processes in Costa Rica, they are doing so with aquifers. Sorry, I missed showing you this. Here's what comes next. To me, this is surprising, not in the least because erupting volcanoes and earthquakes are the most present, or had been historically the most present geological processes in Costa Rica. But since about 30 years ago, this orientation shifted to aquifers. As geologists and community members pull aquifers to the surface of collective attention, they are also pushing their imagination downwards. And there they find much more than layers of rock. They encounter choreographies that articulate scientific, kinship, political, and financial aspects. Through these choreographies, joining forces with aquifers entails paying attention to the push and pull of matter, of capital, and of people's imaginations. These choreographies are turned into epistemologies of geological presence with the help of models, those charismatic objects that help bring people together. As many SDS scholars have shown, good scientific models render worlds knowable by embodying the knowledge and experiences that modelers translate into them. Scientific models also need supporters, social institutions and communication systems to be recognized as valuable and to travel. Nevertheless, while materially produced, and we're very aware of this, scientific models tend to continue to be described as things that you hold in your head, not as things that you hold in your hands. Since the mid-20th century, the scientific models that circulate in public life have become increasingly quantified. New and powerful forms of computing allow scientists to combine observations with numeric techniques to make sense of processes that go far beyond what humans can phenomenologically experience. But today, I want to focus on another kind of model, a model that has captured my imagination now for many years. And this is the physical model. In contrast to quantitative ones, physical models render the world knowable, not only by embodying or sedimenting forms of knowing, but through their iconicity, through their capacity to replicate the entities that they are models of. And maybe one of the most famous ones, is this one. These models restage relations that cannot be easily conveyed in 2 dimensions. Through their circulation and charisma, physical models become a medium of traffic between sciences and the wider culture. In Costa Rica, there is one model that has gained significant prominence as people join forces with water as geological force. And it's this one. People like Jorge, a geologist and a public servant who travels the country with this model, are really invested in creating this connection with the underground through making the model work, as he says. He is committed to going analog. He visits communities, crafts stories, and invites audiences to join forces with water to imagine their own geological presence. Jorge works for one of the many public agencies that has oversight over water in Costa Rica. His agency specializes in subterranean water. Jorge is the only one that I have seen use this model. And the way this works is that he takes water and he pours the water on top of this model and waits for it to infiltrate. Then he tells stories of people living on the surface of the earth, people going about their everyday lives, extracting water, cooking their meals, oil spills happening. And then he moves on to describe water flowing and moving underground, or under the surface. And this movement being provoked by either water extraction, gravity itself, and he describes situations where, for instance, wells can't reach the water table anymore, conditions of scarcity, and so on. As with other 3D physical models, this one is a sculptural object designed to be seen from a variety of angles. Jorge casually makes the model work, as he says, at environmental fairs, school events, or training workshops. He restages people's daily geological presence, providing access to something that is not apparent in everyday life, something that is inaccessible to the senses. This kind of geological presence he makes graspable is not based on the unity of the earth or on ideas of deep time, as his training in geology could lead one to expect. Instead, Jorge takes his audience through a choreography that turns geological presence into casual, everyday relations through stories of pumping water, oil spills, septic tanks, rain, drought, subsidence. Jorge's model breaks with the quantitative tradition that is dominant in hydrogeology. He also challenges the prestige of quantification as the legitimate scientific language of government. Joining forces with water in this way entails multiple shifts in perspective. At his public appearances, Jorge reduces the scale of the human, minimizing the scale of human presence in relation to the size of layers of rock and gravel, undergirding the sanitation habits of, say, a hypothetical señor he describes as living on the surface of the earth. The audience imagines this little person flushing his toilet or pumping water out of the aquifer. The scale of human activity, in comparison to the vast volume of underground space, appears tiny. At the same time, the model and Jorge's stories allow people to widen the scale of their own sense-making as humans. Aligning his story with the staged movement of water, Jorge grants his audience the power to sense a vast underground that otherwise remains intractable. His observers gain a volumetric reach that makes graspable a choreography of humans, matter, and gravity pulling and pushing each other. The choreographic movement and scalar oscillations in Jorge's model and in his stories braid fragments, unvalued and often ignored stories. Jorge's work is geologic not only because of its subject, but also because of its pace and because of its force. He does not require a pre-existing scale of the wholeness of the earth, that Cold War and imperial vestige that I'm trying to work against. But also, he has no nostalgia for a world that was. Mourning is not part of his or his community collaborators' repertoire. Instead, with this model, what emerges is a resonant awareness of what it means to be a geologic presence in terms other than necessarily extractivist ones. A resonance awareness of how much work joining forces entails. These days, Jorge is tired, as many of us are. His work visiting communities and with local environmental commissions is not hugely appreciated by his bosses. He's being pressured to perform more traditional geologic research and to focus on reviewing license requests for well drilling. A newly elected populist president in Costa Rica is reinventing austerity, flirting with structural adjustment policies, and cultivating authoritarian futures. Public institutions, such as Jorge's, are performing an important containment work in this new context. As a somewhat unique public servant, Jorge is worried and frustrated. To conclude, forms of planetary extractivism take the underground as a deep time vault containing minerals and carbon-based resources to be endlessly translated into capital. And one of the most powerful examples that I have seen of this is this billboard at the Houston International Airport. There are many people around the world, though, trying to escape the grip of this image. Many do so spectacularly, with very visible tactics. Think about protests, think about soups splashing paintings, think about UN conferences. Others, like Jorge and his audiences, are casual planetary actors that do not resort to the Earth or to the Anthropocene to come to terms with their geologic presence. I take the work Jorge does with this model as a field of action throughout which people who were formerly classified as citizens of a nation are becoming geological residents of the planet. The 3D physical model that has captured my attention now for a while joins forces with people through events that go unrecognized as planetary happenings because they do not explicitly signal planetary worries. Terms like extinction, annihilation, or death are not necessarily invoked. And yet, Jorge's practices of the earth are political, even if they are not salvational. They are casual efforts to engage planetarity with the aim of affecting its place-specific trajectories. So with this in mind, we might want to end by reconsidering a question. If we think of our own forms of presence as STS scholars, what if we paused to ask, with whom or with what are we joining forces these days? Because joining forces is always a hard process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Vivette and Gabriela, for that amazing set of papers. We are going to be able to take some questions and some comments that maybe try and link these together. We have a roaming mic, so just let Amanda know. Oh, so we have someone.
It's on? Okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you, the three of you, for those very important talks. I was thinking I did well waking up early. I had a question for Vivette. Oh, now it's on? Yeah. I had a question for Vivette. I was wondering how you tie those ideas around absence and knowing without to questions of exile and migration. I was just thinking about my own parents and their trajectories. So quick context, they left Algeria in the 90s and there was this big civil war and there were more than 200,000, dead and disappearances. And I'm thinking, with this idea of the migrant caravan, the one they brought with them is one of ghosts the ghosts of the dead and the missing, but also of the living and the lively and all that's left behind. And so I was wondering, yeah, how those ideas or how that collapses.
Thank you for waking up early. We appreciate it, and for your question. So I think without, just as los desaparecidos is a category that overflows. Those disappeared in Mexico, the number that this morning rose above 108,000 might include missing migrants as well. The disappeared that appear on that database have to be claimed or reported to the National Search Commission. But there are many more, especially migrants, who do not report their missing to the National Search Commission because of the political circumstances in which they find themselves and they disappear. So there are many more missing persons, and many of those that we really don't know even when or if they disappeared are migrants coming from Central America towards the United States, crossing the Mexican territory. So without definitely encompasses that which is not even quantifiable in those databases. So I think it works in that way as an overflowing category that encompasses that, but it makes it all the more difficult to know without these missing migrants who are not even registered in those databases.
Amanda, we've got a...
Thank you so much for such an outstanding panel. I'm also very happy that I woke up early. I have a comment question, I guess, for Gabriela, I would start with. I'm thinking about the Colorado River and your comments about the invisibility of water in the Colorado. And I wonder how, as well, with the border contestation and the 1944 treaty between the US and Mexico, we can also think about the other overlapping sovereignties of the indigenous nations along the Colorado that have claim to that river, both through the Winters Doctrine of 1908, but which establishes the legal basis for claims from time immemorial, and how the Colorado River is becoming further invisibilized as it becomes paper water, right, in these legal settlements. So you have Navajo Nation, you know, in a huge battle with the state of Arizona. And so how do we think about these overlapping and interlocking jurisdictions and multiple sovereignties that are being worked out and contested through the Colorado River itself? So we have not only the contestation of two settler states, but the other competing sovereignties around the Colorado, which when I hear talks by indigenous geographers and others on this issue, we now are asked to think about water in its paper form, which further disembeds it, decontextualizes it from those places. And then just a quick comment for Andrea, you know, models allow us to make certain kinds of claims. So I'm thinking about extractivism and extractivist movements that are using models to make claims for policy or make claims for change. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on the material aspects of those models. So, for example, people who are working with extractivist presences in green energy or biogas or methane capture, there's a different kind of materiality there, and it's much harder to model, I think, than what Jorge's doing, where we can actually imagine sort of the layers of the subsurface. So just two comments and invitations for elaboration. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that terrific question. I'm so glad you brought that up. And the term that I have heard more often than paper water is virtual water, because we are now dealing in commodities that don't really exist. In terms of the measures that are used in the treaty, that are measures that cannot be given because the Colorado is shrinking. So when we talk about trade in water right now at the border, we are talking about virtual water, saying virtual, and virtual, I mean water that isn't there, but water that's still, Mexico's accumulating a debt of water for the future, of water that doesn't have now and probably will not have in the future, but will still have to pay. So we are dealing with virtual currencies of water right now. So with your wonderful question about, we can't just talk about these two nation states, we need to also be speaking about the indigenous people who were there before the creation of either the United States or Mexico. That is the crucial question. And what's happening right now in the area that I'm most familiar with, which is Sonora and the Yaqui River, which is parts of the river that were given to the Yaqui in the 1930s under Lázaro Cárdenas, but were never actually given to them. AMLO, a year or 2 years ago, again made the overture saying that this was again Yaqui water that goes first to Yaqui and then to agricultural farmers. The interesting thing is that there's less water. So again, we're dealing with virtual currencies, political currencies that have much more meaning in the social sphere than they do in the actual sphere of tangible water. So when you bring up indigenous nations, it's a really interesting conversation that's happening right now where there is this contestation of the rights of indigenous people, but the water is no longer there. So, or the water, the amounts that are needed for agricultural success or transformational success in the lives of these individual communities, that water doesn't exist anymore. So these transactional actions, such as the one taken in the Yaqui Valley, what real weight does that have to say that we are returning your river or that we are returning your water when much of that river is gone or polluted? And what does that mean to return something that's no longer there? So I'm really glad you brought that up. I think it's vitally important, and it's a conversation that's happening now because yes, water is being returned, but it's not water in its actual liquid form, but an imaginary virtual sense of the meanings of water. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you so much for your comment. And I'm going to piggyback on this last thing that Gabriela said. To different extents and to different degrees, this impossibility of precisely knowing is the condition out of which all modeling in relation to water is taking place and has been taking place. So these claims to have a sort of positivistic control over knowing the water that is there, it's a claim that performs really important political work, such as inspiring a treaty, or these days, all sorts of watershed modeling, water allocation rights, water rights allocation, etc. All of those are based on the presumption that you know when everybody knows that you can't really know and you don't fully know. So the distinction between green energy, for instance, and water is a distinction of historical thickness in the sense of how much work has been done to establish in a consensus that certain models, quantified models, are the appropriate ones to deal with these questions, even if it's impossible to verify on the field, to put it in those terms, that the quantities that are being claimed in the models are the ones that are existing over there. Very long way to say that instead of making a distinction between new, greener technologies and older ways of quantifying water as radically different things, I see them as sharing the same foundation of impossibility. But there's a different kind of thickness in the terms of the institutions and the labor that has been gone to producing these quantified models. And most of those are quantitative, of course, mathematical models that are run through computers. But I'm really taken by this return to physical models in the face of knowing clearly that you can't quite know. And this is certainly the case for aquifers and groundwater. It's really, really difficult to know, to quote unquote, know how much water there is. The models and the people that produce these models, the quantitative ones, would tell you this. This is something that we're working with, and there's a consensus around it, but we don't know. The second part, they just tell you quietly, right? Because there's so much at stake. But the physical models are something that for STS scholars were there for a while as part of our attention, but with the datification of the world and the digitalization of the world, sort of went to the side. And in contexts like this in Costa Rica, they're performing really important political work, scientific political work. And that's why I'm really drawn to paying attention to those. But thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you so much for this collection of provocations this morning. This is a question which is inspired by Andrea's presentation, but which I think has resonance across the others as well. I think about the power of humble representation of Jorge's model. In comparison with the sophisticated representations that are presented, the quantifications, the virtual models, the things that require hours of computational time and that are presented to us in graphics and virtual spaces. I think about the connection between that and the hunger stones and the power that the hunger stones have in their resonance across media spaces. And I wonder, I suspect that there are also, Vivette, there are also connections to humble representations and the way that humble representations have power to move politics differently than the official statistics on the Government of Mexico's webpage. I wonder how we theorize the difference in power of humble representations and the sophisticated representations of technoscience. I think about this a lot as someone who is partially in a faculty of education, where we have abandoned closets full of physical demonstrations that are no longer used in the era of virtual tools and technologies and coding for children, and the power of those humble representations to move emotions and actions. I wonder if you could help me theorize the difference in power.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful provocation. I think to think about power in these spaces, and in my particular case, to think about power and water, it really, I want to underline the focus of the visibility, either of what water does or what water does not do, where it's either drought or flood, and how much in this space, I didn't get to speak much more because I realized the time. The second example was about this agricultural valley in which I'm currently doing my research. And much of this valley is incredibly important because it's where the Green Revolution was launched from Mexico. The problem is that after more than 60 years of experimentation on this soil with pesticides and with fertilizer, this soil is dying. But so is the runoff that goes into El Mar de Cortés, the Sea of Cortés, and that is killing off the marine life because of the amount of nitrogen that is contained in this runoff. This is about power and hierarchies, but it's about who is visible. The farmers, the poorer farmers are not visible, but the commercial farmers are visible, and they have a lot of power. And they are the ones who can purchase a lot of fertilizer and insecticide to produce these mass quantities, in this case of wheat. But those who have less power, the Yaqui in their community, those are the ones who are fighting for the water. So it's this really interesting circular story in which the water was taken away from them, but it's now falls on the Yaqui to become the protectors of the water. They're the ones who block the highways. They're the ones who are protecting the river, but it's now of the runoff and polluted water that comes. So to answer your question, it's an issue of who has visibility, but also who has the ability to carry a message. The hunger stones are a really compelling story, but the Treaty of 1944 is not really such a compelling narrative, a journalistic narrative, but that is a hunger stone that has been happening for decades. We don't call it such, but that treaty itself, dealing with virtual waters and measures that no longer exist, is itself a hunger stone. So just to, in that really warped way, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it's about the hierarchies of power that have been in place since before in this space agriculture happened. And they are replicating hierarchies of colonization in which those who lost their land and water before are now again losing their land and water and are forced to use a different language to protect it. It's now about human rights, whereas before it was land. It's now about dignity, where it was previously about access to resources. Same battles, a different language. And that also speaks about who has the power to change the language and the fight.
Thank you for a wonderful comment, and then I'm imagining the closet with all of the objects that are there, and you're exactly right. I mean, I was just emotionally, and my imagination was completely taken when I went to this, between you and I, fairly decrepit bureaucratic building, and they showed me this thing that they take all around the country to try to do something different, to try to, fight off the pressures that they are dealing with, as many communities and people around the world are. So to me, it's the question of joining forces that brings me back to this, to the model, and this comes out of a feminist understanding of of being really careful about where you put your attention, and what are the consequences of joining forces with certain questions and certain objects of analysis and not other. And that sort of guided me, at least, in terms of picking up this thing that I've been thinking about for a long time now. And I've shared other stories around it here at 4S. And so the question of who or what do we join forces with as scholars has a manifestation in terms of what are the questions and what are the objects that we follow as scholars. And if you allow me, one answer to that question is you could imagine yourself as short-circuiting the dominant languages of your time. It's not the only strategy, there are plenty of strategies. So at a time in which digitalization and computing is the thing that we hear all around us, pushing forward what is knowable, what is actionable, what can be the object of struggles around justice. What happens if you ask yourself what things don't fit into this saturated environment that we're in, that promotes attention to certain kinds of things at a time when we're told that everything is virtual, everything is digital. It's true, almost everything is happening that way. And at the same time, it's true that everything is analog, right? And this is the commitment of this public servant who's a pretty humble person that is doing incredible work, pretty much in isolation in his agency. Now, the previous support that he had is vanishing, and there's a question of what's going to happen next. And so the last thing I'll say is, in theorizing, paying attention to that, it's also for me a question of theorizing your own politics and the kinds of associations that you build when you write a paper about something and not about something else. And how can we have a broad array of alliances, political alliances that come out not only through activism, but also through the kinds of questions that we ask. I hope that spoke some to your question.
Thanks so much for your question, Noah. In the case that I study, the humble representations of the disappeared come, of course, from unofficial sources, and they tend to be estimates rather than precise quantifications counted to the last digit. These estimates that are usually larger than the official numbers and sources have a powerful do powerful work to represent and to visibilize a phenomenon. There's also, again, a tendency to represent the disappeared in terms of surplus rather than precise numbers. And I have two examples. In 2010, 72 migrants were massacred in what is called La Masacre de San Fernando in the border state of Tamaulipas. And memorialization of this massacre and these victims came to be known as Más de 72, more than 72. So you take the number that became visible and you add the plus to call the attention to, again, this surplus, this overflow, what is not there, what we haven't seen, but that we know is there. Also with the case of the 43 students disappeared in students from Ayotzinapa. There is also the remembrance of and the memorialization as más de 43, more than 43. These are the only ones we see, but the estimate and the extent of disappearance is much larger. And this is a way, these humble estimates of surplus is a way to calling attention to without.
Thank you so much. I think we might just bring this to a close. That's such a beautiful way to end. And I think we've all learnt about finding ourselves in the absence of water, in the absence of people, in the absence of data, in the absence of ways of seeing. And I think you've given us so much to think about in how to read the warnings, to make geological presence through prospective world making, through finding how to know absence and how to visualize and model these surpluses that we can't see, and ultimately how to make displacement homely. So I'd like to invite everyone here to thank our beautiful speakers for handing up these beautiful treasures of thought. So I'd now, just for our transition from the plenary is through another beautiful space of thought and feeling and remembering. So I will hand over to Sandra.
Hello, I want to share with you something that is an ongoing project and also invite you to participate on this ongoing project that will be ongoing still today and tomorrow, and hopefully I am negotiating, so will also be ongoing on the website. And the project is the In Memoriam. Maybe some of you had received the invitation to send pictures, images, audios, text, a diversity of things. This project is inspired on the way we in Mexico live with our dead, which is a very happy and colorful and sensorial experience. But it is also inspired by things I've been learning during these days at the conference. First of all, from the Sonic Street technology project that will also honor us with an event tomorrow midday, kind of, I think, around 2, something like that. Yeah. In that sense, I see this presentation as an assemblage of technologies and of memories. And it has also been inspired by the stories that people have been telling me and that I've heard people tell each other when they are in front of the In Memoriam, which is on that other side of this wall. And also, I want to take some words that Gabriela Sotolaveaga said right now about for life, we need death, but in this case, it's a happy death or a nice death. And life continues after an end. So with that, I want to leave you also with a song that is a bit longer than the presentation, so you could use it to stretch and to leave to go watch the football also. The song is also part of the In Memoriam. ¿Subes?
Lo mismo se lleva todo el tiempo. No bailes cuchanero y el amor calzones, pero pasadito el tiempo quedan igual de tres. Tu tiki taka, ven a todos sin comerciantes, bueno, para mal, las cosas que valen 5 es siempre la cama. Pero este mundo de frío, pobrecito de repente, lo mandaron al infierno para quitarlo. Llévate donde cortaste y te sientes. Chupan como garrapata. Con el sudor de su frente, para que sus hijos coman aunque no. Mientras muchos abusivos viven violando las leyes, ganando lo que ellos quieren por andarse haciendo. Pues lo mismo hay que hacer. La balanza de la vida estamos desnivelados. Hay pocos que ganan mucho y muchos no ganan nada. El trabajo del obrero no tiene compensaciones. Con esto vivir y sueldo no alcanza ni paga. Cuidado, señor, los que ya son contadores. Ahí vienen las elecciones, vamos a ver. Para ver tu